Today I want to talk about Frege's article, A Thought, a Logical Inquiry. It starts off being about the nature of logic and the nature of truth, but it very quickly turns into something else, gives you his theory of what thought is, and ends up really giving you his argument against idealism. And so in order to understand, I think, what's going on in this article, we really have to back up to that first lecture I gave about the nature of, you might say, the history of philosophy and how Frege finds himself at the beginning of the 20th century looking at a world that is largely idealist in philosophical terms. And he starts thinking, initially in this article, along with the idealists, saying, yeah, I mean, what if everything before the mind is an idea? Well, then there is a kind of problem about the correspondence theory of truth, for example, because it looks like it's asking us to judge whether my idea corresponds to a fact, for example. But how can I do that if everything before the mind is an idea? I've got to be at best comparing one idea with another idea. And so Berkeley ends up concluding that this kind of talk about comparing reality with my idea is just incoherent. And Frege starts with that thought. Yeah, I guess it's incoherent. But by the end, as we'll see, it turns out that there's something very different going on. And he's ending up rejecting the idealist premise with which he starts. Now, it doesn't come up back around full circle and say, so what does that really mean about the nature of truth? Which is one of the weird things about this article. But anyways, what is idealism in philosophical terms? What is idealism? We're not talking about the ordinary sense of the term, right? Where somebody is idealistic if they, just have high ideals and, have big goals and that type of thing. Yeah.
Well, this is from someone who doesn't understand at all.
Okay, sure.
From what I was reading, it's kind of like it places emphasis on spirit, and everything comes from the mind, right?
Everything comes from the mind. Good. So here's one definition that I've often used. It's the thesis that everything is mind dependent. Everything comes from the mind. Everything is generated by the mind. Projected by it. The world is something like a projection or a construction. So that's one way of thinking about idealism. What are some other ways of thinking about idealism? Yeah?
We have no access to things in themselves.
No access to things in themselves. So good. We think, something about, well, think about Berkeley's attacks on Locke, the attacks on the idea of substance, the attacks on the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. All those are ways of saying, look, we don't have any access to the things, so don't ask me to draw a distinction between the qualities that are really in the thing, the primary qualities, and the secondary qualities that are not really in the thing, but are just ideas in the mind. All I have access to are the ideas in the mind, so there's no way to access things in themselves to draw that distinction. Similarly, don't ask me about the concept of substance. That has something to do with some underlying thing that holds those qualities together. Well, from Berkeley's perspective, qualities are nothing but ideas, so you're asking what holds the ideas together? And that would be a thing in itself, but I have no access to that. So now notice that an idealist in this sense doesn't so much say there is nothing that is mind independent, but says, I couldn't have access to it. So often these attitudes go hand in hand. The idealist says, look, I could never know about things in themselves. It would be one thing to make the bold claim there are no such things, but it's another weaker claim to just say, maybe there are such things, but they lie beyond anything I could know. So Kant, for example, is often described as an idealist, even though he has a section of the Critique of Pure Reason which he entitles The Refutation of Idealism. Why is he usually considered an idealist? Because he holds things in this. He actually denies this. He thinks there are, well, he can't officially say there are, because existence is a category, but he can sort of talk about noumena and things in themselves. But on the other hand, he denies that we have any access to them. So in practical terms, he becomes an idealist. He's not in a position to say there are no such things. That's something subsequent idealists in the stronger sense do. But he can say, it's tempting to hypothesize. In fact, he does hypothesize things in themselves. as explaining our experiences, but they are things we not only can't know about, can't even talk about, really. And they're just the unconditioned equal to X, he says in the critique. Any other thoughts you have about ways of characterizing idealism? I think those are the two key ideas that we need to distinguish. If we look historically at the way this has been presented, for example, if we look at Berkeley, what is Berkeley's main thesis, famous thesis? To be is...
To be perceived?
To be perceived, yeah. To be is to be perceived. And, of course, he has everything perceived is an idea. So that's going to entail that everything that is an idea. And since ideas are dependent on the mind, that's a version of idealism in the first sense. So Berkeley is going to be really leading us to that. But the slogan here that we might recognize and want to be on the lookout for is that thought that to be is just to be perceived. To be is to be before the mind. Any other ways of characterizing this? Actually, there's one I mentioned right in that first lecture when I said Josiah Royce, writing around the same time as Frege, actually, lays out an idealistic picture of the world. And he puts it this way: the world is such as ideas are made of. Now, that's a weird Shakespearean way of putting it, but there is a slight difference from Berkeley. Notice he isn't saying the world just consists of ideas. The world is such as ideas are made of. So whatever it is makes up ideas, makes up the world. Ideas and the world are in the same category, consist of the same stuff. Is the world then just ideas? Well, that's fully compatible with what he says, but in a certain sense, he's a little squishier than that. And why is he squishier than that? Why does he want to say the world is such as ideas are made of? It isn't just because he's poetic. Yeah.
Well, if he can't, I mean, I'm not familiar with his philosophy, but if he can't talk about the world beyond his own ideas, how can he even say that, you know, it's made of ideas or not?
Ah, okay, yes, right. Suppose we have, yeah, that's such a few pieces of chalk, I don't want to be cavalier, just toss them around here. The world is such as ideas are made of is a little bit vague. And notice, I think you're right to say, gosh, if all we have access to are ideas, mental stuff, as it were, then who are we to say what the world really is? It would be one thing to say the world is something like a collection of ideas. But notice ideas are differentiated from one another. For example, you might think, look, in Frege's essay that we're looking at, there are different ideas, right? There are ideas about logic, ideas about truth, ideas about meanings and senses, ideas about thoughts. Those are different ideas. But now, are there real differences in the world, according to Royce? Actually, he's one of these guys who says, there's one thing. He's like the cowboy in City Slickers. You know, it's all about one thing. Except he doesn't go on to say, and it's up to you to figure out what the one thing is. Well, in a way he does, but I mean, it's more like, yeah, it's all about the one thing, the world spirit. Okay, there's this one big thing. There's like one mind, and it's the big world mind. And you and I are just, well, what? Are you and I just ideas in the world mind? He doesn't exactly want to say that. And he doesn't want to say anything about the relationship between that whole, in a sense, and a particular idea or a particular thinker. And so that's part of why he ends up saying the world is such as ideas are made of. It's the same type of stuff, but it's like this grand big unity. And is it something underlying them? Is it all just the collection of all those ideas? What is it? He doesn't want to commit. So in a certain sense here, just as an idealist in this sense says things in themselves, hey, I don't know, I don't think we can say much of anything about that. The world, do I want to commit to that being an idea, a collection of ideas, somehow mental stuff, the stuff out of which ideas are formed, etc.? He doesn't think we're in a position to make that kind of judgment. So this is, I think, intentionally vague. But anyway, the reason I lay these out is, number one, this was an influential version of idealism at the time that Frege was writing, a rather popular one. And Royce was a good writer, which is part of the reason his view had some impact. Even though today nobody reads Royce, really. Have any of you ever read any Royce? No, nobody ever reads any Royce, except me. Okay, and why? Because I want to know what these guys are responding to in part. And partly because once you start, it's like, he is a good writer. And he says preposterous things. So it's great, you know? Anyway, that is the target. And so as we start thinking about what Frege is doing here, initially it sounds like he's doing something very much in conformity with this. And although Frege is a mathematician primarily and not a philosopher, I think there's something brilliant about what he's doing here. He starts out saying like, hey, you idealists, I'm one of you guys. I mean, what do you think? I'm German, right? And we Germans are idealists. So hey, I mean, hey, you know, I share your view. Yeah, this idea of truth corresponds. It can't be that, right? It's got to be some other mystical, indefinable thing. But then by the end of the essay, he ends up utterly rejecting the idealist premise. And so, how does he get there? Well, I think the core of the argument lies in his trying to understand the differences between ideas, on the one hand, give myself a little space here, ideas and things, and then we're going to have this other category of thoughts. So let's start asking certain basic questions about ideas and about things. After all, according to, for example, Berkeley's version of idealism, a thing is just some collection of ideas. This piece of chalk, for example, is really just this sort of bundle of ideas. What are some of the ideas that would be contained in this?
Calcium.
Good, calcium, white, chalk. What else? Small.
The primary and secondary qualities?
Yeah, Berkeley wouldn't distinguish them, but sure, we could talk about the length, for example, the mass of it and so forth, the primary qualities in Locke's terms, and the secondary qualities, not only the whiteness, but also how it feels. You know, it's smooth here on the cylindrical part, and on the edges, it's like kind of powdery. And it's, is it solid? Yes, I can't squish it. Is it fragile? Yeah, I dropped one a minute ago and a little shard shot off of it, and so on. So we can describe a variety of these primary and secondary qualities, to use that traditional terminology. And it's just a bundle of all those qualities, right? Now, can you perceive it? So anyway, Berkeley's going to say, oh yeah, these should be the same thing, right? This is just a bundle of those. But now, can you perceive the chalk? Can you see it? Sure. Can you hear it? Well, you could feel it if I passed it around, but it seems like a waste of time, and I'll just get all this stuff I'm allergic to on your hands. So, first question is perceivable. As Frege puts it, ideas. Okay, can ideas be seen? Actually, things definitely can be, right? At least most things. Really tiny things, really distant things, maybe not, but, you know, ordinarily things are perceivable. The kind of thing, anyway, that can be perceived, can be seen, felt, touched, heard. What about, or even smelled? This doesn't have much of an odor. Actually, I think my kids at one point had chalk that not only had colors, but had odors. So as you were using it, like the red would smell like cherries. It was very odd. Anyway, so, ideas. Are ideas perceivable?
No.
No, right. Have you ever seen an idea? Have you ever smelled an idea? Ooh, you know, so somebody says, I have an idea. I say, oh, that smells weird, man. That's, you know, that doesn't make any sense, right? At least the idea can't smell. Maybe it smells weird that that guy has an idea. But anyway, no, ideas can't be perceived. They're in the mind somehow. They can't be perceived, at least in the ordinary sense in which things like pieces of chalk can be perceived. Well, the second question he asks, and this is indeed what Frege says, ideas can't be seen or touched, can't be smelled, nor tasted, nor heard. I go for a walk with a companion, I see a green field. I have a visual impression of the green as well. I have it, but I don't see it. So I have an idea, and so we can indeed say, is this something I have? Well, in the case of an idea, yeah, I have an idea. But do we, in the same sense, have a piece of chalk? I mean, in a certain sense, I have it, right? Because at the moment it's in my hand. And you could say in another sense, what really belongs to the University of Texas. The University of Texas has chalk, but it's not had in the same sense in which an idea is had, right? It's not in the mind in the same way. And so we have to say, yeah, it's at least not in that same sense at all. Now, he says one has sensations, feelings, moods, inclinations, wishes. An idea which someone has belongs to the content of his consciousness. So he says the field and the frogs in it, the sun which shines on them, are there no matter whether I look at them or not. But the sense impression I have of green exists only because of me. I am its bearer. So that's the next question. Does it require a bearer? Well, the field and the frogs, do they need a bearer? No. Right? How about the sun? Does it need a bearer? No. But what about my sensation of green? That has to be my sensation of green, right? It requires a bearer, somebody who has that sensation. It seems absurd to us that a pain, a mood, a wish should rove about the world without a bearer independently. An experience is impossible without an experient. The inner world presupposes the person whose inner world it is. So, ideas need a bearer. Things of the outer world are, however, independent. So ideas have, and in fact, need bearers. Here I should not just say, has one, I mean need a bearer. And ideas do need a bearer. Can't have an experience without somebody experiencing it. However, a thing, it doesn't need a bearer. And now, finally, we get to a fourth criterion. In effect, he says every idea has only one bearer. No two men have the same idea. But is that true of objects? Yeah, go ahead.
How are we distinguishing between having an idea and bearing an idea?
They're really the same thing. So this is, in a sense, is it something we can have? And here, is it something that is absolutely required? I think that's the distinction. Because at first glance, it looks like his second point and his third point are actually the same. But I think it's not. Is this the kind of thing that a person can, and it typically does have? And then, is this the kind of thing that needs to have someone have it in order to even exist? So this has to do with the possibility of relating to it in a certain way. And this has to do with the necessity of relating to it in that way. Now notice, it's a necessity, however, that goes the other direction. Here it's more like, can I have this idea? And here it's more like, does the idea, sort of draw like this, does the idea need a bearer? Does the experience, the sensation, and so on, have to have a bearer? So here you think, gee, can I have a tree in the same sense in which I have an idea? No, that's a totally different thing. But here, could the tree exist without anybody having it? Sure. Suppose there were a tree in a forest and nobody ever perceived it. Would the tree still exist? The answer here is, well, sure. Right? I mean, undoubtedly, there are stars, planets, etc. in the universe that nobody's ever seen. That doesn't mean they don't exist. And so they aren't the kinds of things that need bearers. Now, you might think, wait a minute, an idealist is going to say, no, I deny the possibility of that. But I think Frege here is just dealing with our common sense idea. Yeah, go ahead.
So for instance, the idea of, say, green requires a bearer
Yes.
because it's an abstraction.
Right. Well, no, not because it's an abstraction, actually, because it's mental. Ideas are mental things. I have this idea, I have this sensation. A sensation is always had by somebody who is sensing. A perception, always by somebody who's perceiving. Yeah?
For someone like Royce, who believes in a world mind, would he agree with this, that ideas need like a bearer, as in like a human mind?
That's a really good question. If we have this thesis that the world is such as ideas are made of, then we'd say, well, actually, Berkeley would say, look, a thing is just a collection of ideas. Royce presumably would say, I don't know what ideas are, and I don't know what the world is, but they're made of the same stuff, okay? And so he would say, actually, I think that, does that stuff need a bearer? Well, yeah, in a sense, this world mind. And so I think he would say, yes, they do need a bearer. But now it's interesting to think about what the argument for that would be. Next time, actually, when we think about G.E. Moore, we're going to be looking at an argument for idealism in some detail and seeing why Moore objects to it. Frege does consider a couple of arguments for idealism, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves yet and think too hard about that. But you're right. Which of these is controversial from an idealist point of view? This surely would be one, right? Where you say, wait, I think actually things do need bearers because things are just collections of ideas, for example, or they're just the stuff that ideas are made of too. And so whatever that stuff is, it's something that has to be in a mind. And that means that in a sense we can have a tree. In fact, we can say, I have a tree in mind. You know, the tree that my wife insisted that the guys cut down recently, that I liked. Every time I look over there, I think, oh, there used to be this nice, utterly bizarre-looking cedar tree, and I miss the cedar tree. So yeah, you could say, come on. I think those would both look controversial from Royce's point. Yeah.
So asking what the cedar tree, excuse me, let me start over. Asking what the difference between the cedar tree that they cut down being there and your image of the cedar tree being there, is that the same? I'm having a hard time.
Oh, no, good. Frege is going to make a lot of this later in the article. Good, there's a difference between the idea, right? The tree I have in mind being there and, well, the idea of the tree being there and the tree being there, right?
Right.
The tree is gone, but my idea is still there. I still have my memory of the tree.
Right.
And I can look at that part of the yard and think, sadly, oh, the tree used to be right there. Okay, so, but maybe eventually I forget about it, and then the idea of the tree is no longer in mind, or maybe I'm distracted by reading Frege, and I'm not thinking about the tree, etc. And so yeah, it looks like, wait a minute, whatever is going on here, the tree can be there without the idea, and the idea can be there without the tree. And so, although he doesn't at this point put it in this, this sort of nice little list he's compiling, in the end, it does feel as if he gives an argument that says, look, these are independent. One can be there without the other. His example actually, well, his example concerns the idea of his brother and his brother. And he said, look, I'm not going to confuse the idea of my brother with my brother. Two people can have different ideas of my brother, but it's still my brother, right? And moreover, I can have thought of the idea of my brother without my brother being present, and my brother can be there, and I might not be thinking about it, and so on. So these look as if they're completely independent. So it's weird to think that one is just reducible to the other. Yeah.
For ideas needing bearers, what about the rediscovery of a lost idea or the reemergence? For example, the discovery of an ancient dead language or something. Is the idea that for the time in which nobody spoke that language, the idea was like dead and then it comes back?
Oh, right. So what do we say about like an ancient language that, for example, I guess really hieroglyphics, for many, many years, nobody knew how to interpret hieroglyphics. So you could see the things there, but the language underlying that system of writing is almost just lost. And then they discovered the Rosetta Stone and were able to actually decipher the writing and now can read hieroglyphics. So you might say that's an example of a language that just completely disappeared. People could still see the symbols but had no idea how to interpret them, and then discover it again. Or the same thing might be true if an entire language just disappears and then ancient scholars find these texts and are able to reconstruct the language. And what's going on there? Well, yeah, the things, in the sense of the hieroglyphics or these ancient texts or whatever, have been there all along, right? The idea was there, and then it disappeared, and then it seems to come back again. It's rediscovered, you might think. But now, wait a minute. This idea is something in a mind. He's thinking about my idea, my perception, for example. So that language is something like, well, what is it like? It's the kind of thing you might say is lost and then rediscovered, right? Whenever we use that language of discovery, that's something that indicates that we're talking about something that isn't just in my mind. After all, what do you mean? I discover it. I suppose I could discover my own memory trace or something, but that sounds weird, right? If I had sort of forgotten that, I say, oh, I remember. I don't say, oh, I discovered my own idea. And so that's going to point toward this third category. So I think that language would be something more like what he would call a thought. Now, it's not exactly a thought. A language is a whole system of thinking, you might think. But it's in this third category. Our particular idea, you might say the idea disappeared. Then very similar ideas came back, but of course in the minds of different people. There is something that is continuous, and that's going to be over in this category. Yeah.
So could you relate these three terms to so that ideas would be synonymous to concepts in his other article, and then things get
Yes.
a referent and thoughts would be a sense?
Yes, exactly, exactly. Right, so these are really like concepts, for example. And actually, also in this category are things he refers to as thinking. So I am thinking about the tree. My thinking about it is something that's happening in my mind. Or I might be thinking about the Pythagorean theorem. That's happening in my mind. But the Pythagorean theorem isn't in my mind. Okay? Similarly, that language might be something people thought about, stop thinking about, then start thinking about again.
Can you say it one more time about the Pythagorean theorem?
Yeah, good. Well, think, what I said about the Pythagorean theorem is that my thinking about it is something that starts and stops. The thinking about it is in my own mind. But the theorem itself is something that you and I can both think about, right? In fact, his last criterion here is it something that is in one mind. And for these ideas, the thinkings and so on, he says, yeah, okay, my perception of the chalk is my perception. Yours is different. You're looking at it from a different angle. You don't have the tactile impression that I am having as I hold it and so on. So your perception of the chalk right now is in your mind. It's different from mine. On the other hand, we're all related to the same chalk. So is the chalk something that is somehow confined to one mind? No. But no, thought. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, if this concept we're talking about, or this idea we're talking about, is anything, so when we assign, when you think about a collection of trees, you could say there are 3 trees there, but 3 is not something that concept, just 3 is not something that exists on the floor or in the sky, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's something that we've assigned the value of that. I mean, it's a language thing.
Good.
Is the same thing true? I mean, I'm just wondering, is the same thing true of kind of these abstract ideas we're talking about today?
Yeah, exactly. So good. Let's think of examples of things that don't seem to fit into either of these categories. And we've already seen some. The Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. That appears to be something that is neither just an idea confined to one mind, because you and I can both think about it at the same time even, and yet it's not something we can see. You can perceive the symbols with which I write it down, but you don't see the theorem. The number 3 is an excellent example of something like this. You and I can both be thinking about it at the same time, so it's not just an idea in one person's mind, but on the other hand, you can't perceive it. It's not like, oh, I was walking down the hallway and there was the number 3. You know, I can say, yesterday I met Karl Rove, but I can't say I met Pi. You know, there I was in this circular room, and suddenly, 3.14159 just walked out and shook my hand. It's not like that. It's something else. Or this language. It can be a lost language, like hieroglyphics or something else. It could be English, let's say. English is something that isn't just an idea in your mind or my mind. It's a language we're speaking, yet you don't perceive the English language in the same way that you perceive, let's say, an individual sentence that somebody utters. So those are all examples of things that don't seem to fit into either of these categories. What are some other things like that? They are intersubjective, you know. Multiple people can in some way use them or think about them and so on.
But some languages do fit into these categories, like Chinese or something, where the characters actually resemble something you might see, like I have vague familiarity, or hieroglyphics, for example.
Yeah.
Like the characters, like a bird might actually mean a bird. You know what I'm saying? It's not a symbol.
Right,
You know what I'm saying?
Well, sure,
But
but it's
so that still falls into that category of language.
sure because I mean I can think something in English or about English. Yeah, what's an example of a thought about English? Well, yeah, this standard American is a rhotic language. Standard British, received pronunciation, is not rhotic. What does that mean? We say ours, and they don't. We say park the car. They say park the car. In Boston, they do that, but then they insert all sorts of R's where they're not supposed to be. And so, you know, that's a thought about the English language and a difference between American and British pronunciation of it. That is something that you and I, now notice, it was a thought in my head, but we were able to actually, I was able to communicate that. How did I communicate? Whether by or uttering a sentence like that, or by giving you an ideogram in either hieroglyphics or let's say a Chinese character that has a meaning that you can actually understand by taking it apart. We don't really have anybody in the philosophy department anymore who can talk about that. But when Tom Sung used to teach Chinese philosophy, he would show you the basic characters and show you what was going on in the character as well as, and for example, if you read Confucius, there are a lot of places where this kind of thing matters. There's a line, to govern is to rectify, and he would show you the characters that actually articulate this, take them apart and show what ideas were involved in that, but then also point out they're pronounced exactly the same way in Chinese, or at least there's only an accent variation. And so it's kind of a pun as well as something that has a kind of content you can only get by looking at the characters. And so sometimes a language can convey a thought. And now here's his idea. These are all thoughts or connected to thoughts. Now a thought is something like a sentence, but these are things that a variety of us can relate to. And so they are outside the head of any individual person. So all of these are, you might say, outside the head. They are, on the other hand, not in the physical world. They're manifested in the physical world, and in a language like English, in actual English utterances, and in English texts and so forth. This theorem, in the symbols with which I write it down, it's manifested in the physical world, also in thinkings, so you and I can both be thinking about the Pythagorean theorem. But they're different. So these thoughts, are they perceivable? Can you perceive the number 3?
No.
No. You can perceive these manifestations. You can perceive the numeral, but you can't really perceive the number. And so they are not perceivable. I'm going to skip this one for a moment. Do they need a bearer? Can the language exist even if nobody remembers it or speaks it?
Yeah.
Sure. So they do not need a bearer. Can they be in more than one mind? Are they confined to one mind?
No.
No. So notice in these respects, they're like things. But in this respect, they're like ideas. Now, what about this? Are they the kind of thing a person can have? Can you have a thought in the same sense in which you have an idea? And can't presumably have a thing. Well, at first glance, I see a number of you nodding yes. And indeed, my first temptation was saying, sure. But here's where his distinction comes between thinking, the thinking of it, and the thought that you're thinking. Okay? you and I can both be engaged in acts of thinking. And the English word thought is just ambiguous between the act of thinking and the content of what you're thinking. So I was drawing this in my little diagram with the little lightning bolt inside of mind, okay? That's sort of the act of thinking, the thinking of a thing. Now that act of thinking is within an individual mind, but the thought that is being done is something you and I can share, okay? So here he ends up saying, yeah, I need a footnote. This is something special. The thought itself is something like the content of the thinking. So thinkings belong over here, but this is something more like contents. And so he introduces a special term for this. You have an idea, you don't have a tree or a star or something, but in this case he says you apprehend the thought. You apprehend that content. And he feels the need to introduce a new term here. It is in many ways much like having the idea. But you've got to be careful because it's really the thinking that is the sort of activity that's analogous to having a sensation, for example, or having an idea in the sense of something springing up in the mind. But then there's the content. And actually, idea is ambiguous in just the same way between, as it were, the having of the idea and then the thing you're having. Yeah.
I have a question about thoughts being in more than one mind. If thoughts are not perceivable, then how are they comparable? Like, how could I test that we have the same thought? So for instance, the piece of chalk, you were saying we each have a different conception of chalk. I don't know why the same wouldn't be true of the Pythagorean theorem.
Right. Good. Okay, so yes, we've got this mind here, and we've got a thinking going on in it. And here's another mind, we'll say, and there's a thinking going on in it too. And now the thinkings are two different acts, two different mental acts, as it were, going on in those two different minds. But he wants to say, look, it is possible for those to express the same thought. So maybe the thought is the Pythagorean theorem. We're both thinking that thought. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. And now, yeah, go ahead.
So what if those two minds didn't arrive at a squared plus b squared equals c squared in the same way?
Good, good, good. He has this long example about Dr. somebody. What was the guy's name? Dr. Loudon? Dr. Where is it? Anyway, the doctor. And he's saying, you know, we might have the same thought. For example, he thinks that the word I is insignificant here in a sense. So if the doctor says, you know, I am in pain, and you say the doctor is in pain, having heard him say that, you're expressing the same thought. He is expressing it in a special way by means of the pronoun I. You're expressing it in a different way by using that name for him, and that's all fine. But then he imagines, suppose two people know the doctor in totally different ways. He's your physician, let's say, so you know him as Dr. L, but somebody else only knows him as the guy next door, or the guy they see occasionally in the bar, Gustav. And so one of you is thinking, Dr. L is in pain. The other is saying, Dr. L, sorry, the other person saying Gustav is in pain. Are they the same thought? This is a question that we're going to come back to a number of times through the course. Frege is raising a problem about the meaning of proper names here that is going to have important echoes throughout 20th century philosophy. And what he ends up saying there is kind of what you're hinting at. Actually, they have different thoughts because they are identifying the referent in different ways. One is thinking my next door neighbor or my drinking buddy. The other is thinking my doctor. And so they're not only in this case using different names, there are different modes of presentation connected to those names. Even if they use the same name, they might have very different modes of presentation. So even the identity of the name is, it seems for Frege, enough to guarantee that they're having the same thought. Yeah.
I'm kind of having trouble with the idea of a thought needing, or not needing a bearer, because I just feel like if we, you know, like in this example, discover a lost language, then I wouldn't think it's like, you know, not right to say that the language just disappeared and then it like appeared again whenever someone who discovered the new language had the idea of it. So I think that the thought actually didn't exist while it was gone. Or while no one thought of it.
Right, right. It is strange to think of a thought being there without a thinker, right? And it is partly because of this ambiguity. If we consider the word thought, or I think really for that matter concept, or idea, or representation, there are a number of things that need to be distinguished carefully if we're contemplating what's going on here. And unfortunately, the language makes it very hard to keep these in mind. Wilfrid Sellars, in his first book on Science and Metaphysics on Kant, makes a big deal of this, saying, look, it's really important to distinguish a variety of things that might be going on. One is, and now here I'm going to use the term act, but it's more like the medieval actuality than it is an action. It's not something you're necessarily doing intentionally. It's not that kind of action. But nevertheless, it's a happening in the mind. So you could say it's an event if you want. One of them is this event or act of thinking, conceiving, representing. Sensation is another of these. But then there's also what? Well, there is the content of that sensation. There is the content of that representing, of that thinking. So we can talk about, in short, what is thought, represented, sensed, etc., etc. Let's call that the content. And then is there anything else? The representation might be my act of representing. It might be what is represented. That's the main and most important distinction. But now, well, I guess the simple way of thinking of it is that corresponds to something that happens in a mind, an individual mind, and then something that has something outside the mind. So you might say the Fregean thought, really, which Sellars is just making a big deal of in that book, is that this one is something that happens in one mind. But then this is something that can be intersubjective. Something that you and I can share. So we might think, in some sense, the same thought, but that's a way of saying our two thinkings, our two events might have the same content. Yeah?
So if thoughts can exist without a bearer, like before the Pythagorean theorem was ever discovered, it
Right.
would have somehow existed.
Yeah.
So then do all possible thoughts exist already?
Ooh,
Like,
good question.
Then
Good
what does
question.
it even mean to exist in that, if everything does?
Yeah, good. We do speak about discovering the Pythagorean theorem, which Frege says, look, in these cases, we do say, it's not that I made it up. You know, if you say, oh, you're the guy who proved the infinite Ramsey theorem, it has a different significance from you're going, oh, you're the guy who made up the infinite Ramsey theorem. It feels like the mathematician is just discovering something, not just making it up, not just creating it. And so that's something that Frege takes as a sign that these things exist even before they're thought of. But now, if you say, well, yeah, it's great as long as you're thinking about truth, right? But how about the following claim? That if you think about the sides of a rhombus, let's say, wait, that's not a rhombus, that's a parallelogram. That's a rhombus. So think about A, B, C, D. And suppose I say I have the following thought. A squared plus B to the 17th is equal to C to the 18th minus D cubed. Maybe that nobody's ever had that thought before, right? But it would be very weird to say, I discovered that thought. Because after all, that's total crap, right? That's not true. And you might say, yeah, we call it a discovery when you have a true thought, a true, let's say, a thinking that is actually of a true thought that nobody's ever thought of before. We call that a discovery. But, you know, that kind of thing we don't call, if I come up with some just kooky idea, that's not, we don't talk about that as a discovery. We're more likely to say, oh, you just made that up. So I think it's not so obvious how well Frege's argument works there. Yeah.
The comedian George Carlin had a thing where he would say, like, you'd ramble on and on and on, and then he would say, here, I just said something that has never been said ever before, ever in the history of time, or
Right,
whatever.
right.
Which isn't that different from, even though he's saying something meaningless that is completely meaningless. It has no significance. But that's not even that different from discovering, if you were, I guess, Pythagoras, thinking about the Pythagorean theorem in the
Right.
first place, right?
Right, right.
Like the significance doesn't.
It's good, yeah, it feels totally different, right? I mean, look, there are infinitely many grammatical sentences of English or any other natural language, and I can easily, in that sense, come up with a thought that nobody's ever had before. Consider the sentence, John ran. I say, John ran and ran. John ran and ran and ran. John ran and ran and ran and ran. Eventually I'm going to come to one that nobody's ever thought of before, just because the world's been finite. Right? And so you could say, well, shoot, man, you just had a new thought. John ran to the 58, power, as it were. Yeah, okay, you can do that, but it seems weird to say you've discovered that idea.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's something. Of course, I shouldn't say idea. Well, in that sense, the content of that. That seems really fishy.
If
Yeah.
it's not a discovery, then I don't know, but I agree, but then I don't know what the hell it is if it's not a discovery, I feel like.
Right. Now I think what Frege's idea is, look, these things outside, what is a thought? It's the sense, well, all thoughts are senses of sentences. Not all senses of sentences are thoughts. But yeah, senses are like this. So remember we drew those as outside the individual mind. This is like a sense out here. The content is something like this sense that exists. And you're right, we only just talk about discovering these senses in special circumstances. But his claim is, look, they're always already there, whether you.
Wait, senses, do you mean sense in the same way when we're talking about things that are perceived?
Oh, no, I don't mean in like the five senses.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean in the sense of Sinn as opposed to Bedeutung.
Okay.
Sense as opposed to reference.
I think your question was really fascinating, and I was actually thinking about that also, how thoughts, up until that moment that they are conceived by somebody, they're kind of like a gray zone. Because like a tree, as a tree would exist before somebody observed it, a thought, like the Pythagorean theorem, I don't really understand where that would lie in existence,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Which seems to lean towards me, almost towards the idealism side, because it seems like you would need a perceiver for that thought to exist in reality.
Right. Well, it is a little weird, right? Could you have contents if there were nothing for them to be the content of? Frege's answer is yes, there would be these senses even in a universe where there were no thinkers. Aristotle at one point, actually arguing against idealism, says, imagine a purely physical world with no consciousness in it, whatever. Seems like there could be such a world. It would exist, but there would be no ideas in the sense of thinkings.
Like Mars?
Well, yeah, like what Mars, but if the whole universe were like Mars, right? Then he'd say, yeah, come on, I mean, there are no perceivers, but it seems to follow from Berkeley's statement, for example, that nothing could be perceived, so nothing could exist. But that's preposterous. Of course things could exist in such a world, and there could be such a world. So if we thought about that, we'd say, well, now, let's press that argument one step further. Would there be senses, would there be contents in that world? Even though there was nothing there to be a conscious thinker, would there be thoughts without thinkings? Could there be concepts in that sense, contents, without anybody conceiving anything? Okay, some of you are saying no, and some of you are saying yes. Frege is with the yes people, saying yes, there would still be these contents, even if there was nobody around to express them.